what I'm mostly going to talk about today is in relation to audiences, in relation to public engagement. Of course, data can be used in a variety of different ways, but in our work, we especially focus on using different sorts of data, all sorts of different data, really can be small, qualitative, or huge, quantitative, big data. But at the heart of it, this is the kind of the question: who are they? Why are they there? What do they expect? What do they think about what's happening to them, the experience? And then what do we do with that sort of information? So I want us to really think about what is the story that we want to tell, and therefore what data do we need? Just being able to represent it graphically with the biggest, the most used words as bigger is, I think, it's been a very useful way of getting beyond giving people graphs or lines of data or kind of being very dry about it. At the audience agency, we have this little acronym that we use to remind ourselves that research needs to be vital. The acronym is VUMI, and we ask ourselves, is the research vital, useful, or merely interesting? That's what it stands for. And what we always say is we want vital and useful, something that we can actually do something with. And if it's talking about research, it might be about what do we know about our marketplace, what interests them, who are they, how might we contact them. On the other hand, it might be about evaluation. What do they think about us? What's their experience? How might we do things differently for them? How might we get other people like them? You know, so vital or useful data. People have a limited attention span, how much time they will take to answer your questions. You need to be focused on what you really want to know. The secondary data is data that already exists. So you don't need to go and find it. You need to go and find it. You don't need to create it. Sorry, let's be clear about this. With the Festivals from India website, we might want to know what, at a basic level, what cultural festivals are there in India? By the way, what is a cultural festival? What is an arts festival? That was an interesting debate we had early on. Who attends them? Who might attend them? And of course, what do Indian cultural festivals need? And we can use this by answering data that already exists, secondary data, or of course, we can go and do primary research, finding new data. Again, always what we want to know is, how do we use this? A lot of organizations, governments, universities have already done research which you can use. This one, for example, comes from the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs. It's a relatively simple question, well, a relatively simple idea, but quite complicated to answer unless you're able to do this globally. It's the question of who has been born in India and living abroad, where do they currently live? And some of this will or will not be a surprise to you, I don't know, but I think quite interestingly, it's useful, for example, in the Festivals from India case, to say, okay, so if we're going to focus either on attracting, say, tourists, visitors from abroad, or on the other hand, streaming online data, to online performances to people, where in fact do people from India currently live, people born in India? And, in this case, the United Arab Emirates is the top one, and we've got Saudi Arabia. And I think for some people, maybe not you guys, not new people, it may not be a surprise because you know India well, but I think some people will be surprised that it's countries from what we call the Middle East and Britain, rather than say USA or even UK, which is only 3%, although the UK has a much longer kind of a lineage with India. What the point is that this is data exists out there. It does take some finding, and it does take some interpretation of what's important. But then on the other hand, you might want to go to primary research. And primary research is where you have to go and find, you've got to go and do research, and you've got to go and find it out. And that can be done in a whole variety of different ways. Some of it may include existing data in the sense, for example, of analytics, which we'll be looking at today. Some of it may require some survey quantitative work, so you've got to go out and ask people questions. Some of it may require qualitative research, focus groups or interviews and that sort of thing. And one of the things I would like to urge today for you to think about is to think beyond demographics. Now, having worked in this field for many years, decades, one of the things I would say is that people often look immediately to demographics, and by that I mean age, where people live, could be ethnicity, could be profession, could be their generation, etc., etc., or gender, whatever. Now, those aspects are obviously important. They do have a bearing on who people are. It has importance for funding, it has importance for our marketing, it has importance for our programming. But I would say you get to a certain point where that is no longer immensely interesting. So what you really need to know is other sorts of aspects. And one of my favorites is motivation. Why are people attending your event? Why do they go? What's interesting to them? What's interesting to your current attenders? What might be interesting to other attenders? And of course, with data, you can also do interesting benchmarking, another aspect to it. And this, of course, requires wider collaboration like you have in India. But it's like, what is the context? What is actually we want? What's this showing us? What's the story it's trying to tell? This is ticketing data. I know some of you are experienced in using ticketing box office data. It's been a big thing in the UK over a period of time. The orange line, of course, is 2020. So that's where you see COVID hit, and you can see that income dramatically declines. And that you could look at that and say, oh, isn't that difficult? What a shame. Or you could also use that graph and go to the government and say, look at how much money we're losing. Give us some emergency funding. As it happens, that's exactly what we did do with the cultural sector. And it was one of the things that led to the UK government giving them giving people more money. We need to be clear that the data we collect has to be linked to what we want to know. And I think there's some basic questions about, are we interested in the marketplace? Do we want to know what's out there and what might be potential? Or are we looking at evaluation in the sense of what's already happening and feeding back how people are already interacting with us? We need to understand what we have already. So let's go and find things that we already know the answer to. We of course need some resources, either time or money, time or money to do this, and this is often a big issue. However, one thing I would urge us all today to consider is that I think if we consider research, data, evaluation as a key part of our work and not as an added extra, I think you start to find the way in which resources can be made available. It has to be a fundamental part of what we're doing if we're serious about the work we're doing in the 21st century. So we need to consider if we've got access to data, what that data might be, and therefore what we still need to carry out. Importantly, we need to consider what are we going to do once we know the answer. Unfortunately, in the rush to get data and start analysis, attention to design is often glossed over. That is not thinking about what we need and how we need to get it. So I use this thing, it's derived from David Spiegelhalter. I've adapted it slightly. I think our data needs to be valid, reliable, and available, by which I mean that it needs to be valid. It needs to be data that's measuring what we want it to measure. So like we said, what can we actually use? What does the data show? What could it show? What do we really need to find out? Is it reliable? And this is a big issue for us, by the way, working with a lot of people. How good is this data? There's a famous phrase in English, it goes rubbish in, rubbish out. In the American version, they say garbage in, garbage out. It means that, for example, looking at the data you input into certain things, it has to be reliable and good. Otherwise, it affects everything else down the line. A really good example actually is ticketing data. So if you are taking people's names and addresses and contact details and or whatever, if you get that wrong early on, you can skew all the sorts of things you find out afterwards. And available, I think this is an interesting topic for us here, just talking in India about this, because you know, we might know what we want to find out and the sort of data we need, but how are we going to get it? Where do we go for it? How might we collaborate with other people to find out the answer to these questions? Right at the end of the line, you've got a point where you're going to have to tell your story to people externally or internally. You might need to learn what it is you want to do. And therefore, in thinking about how you're going to tell your story and who you want to tell it to, that will actually affect how you will collect you know, what it is you're going to collect and how you're going to collect, because you're going to need to think about, do we want quantitative data? Do we want qualitative data? Do we want to show graphs, or do we want to show kind of nice quotations? Here's the word cloud example that I was talking about earlier. Maybe we're thinking about infographics, about the sorts of ways that we might present this data. I think sometimes infographics can be horribly simplistic, almost cliche ridden. However, good infographics, clearly told and telling interesting facts, can be really useful, especially about telling the story to people beyond who, you know, our normal circle of people that we're working with, people who understand data. You've got to tell the story in a different way to different people. Using the data that we have, there are different aspects to it. I think there's partly about understanding where we are and what we're doing, the context and vision. I think this is especially important for directors, executives, the senior management teams, the boards, the executives of organizations, to understand, where are we? What are we doing? How does what we want to do actually match what's available there, what's in our public? You know, if we're an organization in Mumbai, what do we know about Mumbai? Are people going to, you know, how does it relate to our vision, etc., etc.? And you know, and then it goes on to more sort of kind of more precise, more focused things, like what is it we're really interested in, which audiences do we want to reach, therefore what might be the strategy, therefore what might be the campaigns that we're going to do. And we're going to look at some of that in our sessions today. What I would like you to do, to consider for about 10 minutes or so, is to discuss between you, what do you want to know about your potential audiences? In fact, it's quite a simple question, but the answer, I think, is quite complicated, or can be quite complicated, because what you need to do is you need to think about what you already know, what you might know but would like confirming. That's often comes up in the work we're doing. That's what by that I mean things like, oh, we always thought people were only coming once a year, but we weren't sure, and now we know they are coming once every 6 months, not once a year. Or we always thought all our audiences were under the age of 24, but they're not, they're aged between 20, you know, that sort of thing. And then there might be some things like, what don't you know about them at all, which you might want to consider. That's always one of the interesting things. So in those breakout rooms, we're not going to do a very complicated feedback afterwards, but what we're going to ask is for someone from each room just to give like a minute, 2 minutes reflection on the sorts of things that have come up in the meeting, in the breakouts. Thank you very much for those discussions. I popped into some of them to see the sort of things that were being discussed, which were very interesting. I wonder if we could just have a little bit of very brief feedback from each of the groups, just kind of the sorts of things that were discussed, the sorts of things people were looking for. Can I go straight to room one? And I think I see that Rashmi has nominated Mimi to share on her behalf. So Mimi, would you like to say something?
Hello there. Yes, I'm from the Center for Historic Houses of India. We are based at a university, but we are kind of inspired by the Historic Houses Association in the UK and the National Trust. So we are kind of a new institution inspired by these. So one of the difficulties is that we have different stakeholders, and how to understand these different stakeholders is number one. And then number two is, how do we actually communicate with our audience? How do we reach them? How do we understand who they are, and how to cater to them adequately?
Just on the stakeholders, just so I understand that correctly, stakeholders, you're talking about what, in a sense, what the stakeholders want to know. Also, is it about telling the stakeholders a story about, or giving the data to, telling the story about the data to stakeholders as well?
Yeah, and in engagement, because we noticed from our social media, every single handle is entirely different, has a different audience.
Right.
So we need to create different content for all of them, or if we have the same content, present it in an entirely different way.
Yeah. And there, on another day, we would talk a lot about segmentation, which is one of my favorite topics, because segmentation answers some of that question, which is like, so thinking about groupings of people in terms of what they might like and how they might want to be communicated.
Exactly. Yeah. And for instance, if I remember one mistake I made. I wanted to do something more for a younger audience, and I created this GIF making competition for jumping Maharajas, and it really didn't go down well when I posted it in the wrong channel because they felt offended. So this kind of thing. But it was very popular in another channel. So yeah.
Fantastic. That's a nice one. Let's go to group two. Someone from group two. I think it looks like Era has been nominated.
Most of our discussions really focused on what we have come to know of the new audience in times, in the last year when everything has gone digital.
Because of COVID.
Yes, absolutely. So it is almost like the learnings of the past so many years have gone straight out of the window, and we have had to pretty much relearn everything else. One of the things that came up, in fact, what Shubham was speaking about, very interestingly, is when they started doing these sessions online, and it was really a free for all. They felt the commitment that the people showed in terms of actually attending the sessions was far lesser than when they started making it restricted. And it was by how do you say, you had to be nominated in that sense, or you had to be selected to attend the session. It was a restricted affair, so they felt they experienced a higher attendance ratio in that sense. When they changed the format. With Red Curtain, what Sumit mentioned was that at each point, they have been trying to create conversations with their audiences who are coming online, who are attending Zoom sessions, to see how is it that the data can be captured, that their preferences can be captured through simple questions that they ask. And that is how they have been trying to do it. At Kala Ghoda, in fact, that's one of the things that we struggled with this year, because while we have this huge audience that attends the offline version each year, or rather used to attend the offline version each year, this year, the 21 version was very different, where it was online and the numbers were nothing in comparison. So, having said that, as a festival, unfortunately, we have not really maximized, or we have not leveraged the power of data that we could have. We have not done that. So that's something that we've learned now, and we're trying to make amends, and we're trying to see what better we can do.
That's good for the moment. I think it really introduces a really important topic for our time around this issue of online or versus offline, streaming, not streaming, COVID, not, big topic. Thank you very much. Let's go to group three, which I think Vikram is going to say something.
Hi, Jonathan.
Hi.
Good afternoon. So my name is Vikram and I'm from Barking Dog Productions and we're based out of Bangalore. When we were discussing the 3 questions that were put out there, a few things that came out quite initially was that as we're making a shift from the new normal back to the old ways of working in a real space, first trying to understand a few of the recurring issues or the recurring questions that we've had over the years as to how do we as an Indian audience associate value with the arts? How do we invest in preservation, protection, and engagement in the arts? While at the same time, why don't Indian audiences spend as much as, say, developed nations audiences like in the West do when it comes down to engaging in the arts? Just to give an example about something as simple as somebody would be willing to spend 350 rupees on an Indian movie, but would not be willing to spend the same amount of money to come out and watch a play or go out for a dance performance that consumed the same amount of time and was culturally more richer probably. Then we also discussed access and privilege, restricting factors, trying to understand, because we are a relatively diverse country, culturally, socially, and economically, with regards to access and privilege itself, are they restricting factors for an audience to develop and engage with? And therefore, by trying to understand that, how could we make it more accessible and inclusive to address the needs of the various groups that are involved? And last and finally, we discussed data capturing itself, which was something that we have experienced here in India, that it's not democratized. The vendors that collect our data from organizers, from customers, don't necessarily share it back with the organizers. We do know that platforms like Insider do, but bigger platforms like, say, Book My Show don't give the organizers the same kind of access to that data that has been captured. Therefore, we're not able to understand where our audiences come from, why they come, and how do we continue to engage with them and retain them. Thank you.
Thank you. That's, that last point, very interesting and very much based on, if you remember that thing I said, data needs to be valid, reliable and available. That very much addresses the available issue, and that can be, you know, and it's such a shame as well, because in a sense the data's there, but like getting it is, or having it shared with you is a really crucial thing. Thank you. Let's go to group 4 finally. I'm not sure.
Hey, hi. Yeah. This is Nidhi here.
Hi,
so we were also a mixed bunch of people, and initially we started off with how language becomes a really important thing, especially with artist groups which, you know, want to perform in more non-city locations. And then one point, like Vikram was saying, with the pandemic, that we said would be really nice to know as performers or any organizer of any event, in fact, is people's willingness to take a risk with respect to against the value that we provide to them as an event. So how willing are they to put themselves at risk to attend the event, especially if it's a physical event now that things are opening up slowly. Collecting data on what kind of events each individual attended. So you can basically map the data that you already had when they registered, and then map it to their experience at the event and how did they engage with the event, and sort of create a future bank for future events to sort of make decisions on marketing or programming for the future editions of an event.
I dropped into the session. I thought it was a very interesting discussion. Thank you very much. That's great. Some really nice topics there as well.